I'll hit our record button here. So I'm going to give Facebook a minute or two just to notify everybody that we're live. And so they don't miss anything, but it is being recorded and it'll show up on our YouTube channel as well, but it'll reside here on Facebook forever too. So that's another, we were talking in the green room earlier about like social media things to do, and sharing this on social media is a really good thing too. So for anybody watching that wants to share it too, we always love that. Gets lots more circulation out there. Sarah, do you have a copy of the book that you can?
I do.
Oh,
look at this and look at this
Wow.
gorgeous cover. I love the cover.
Me too.
Oh, so do I. They
Yes,
did such a beautiful job, didn't they?
they did. So we're here today with Emily Hourican. Did I say it correctly?
Yes, you did. You said it pretty well. Well done.
And Sarah Sleeper, and we're going to be talking today about her new book, The Glorious Guinness Girl. So we are so excited about that. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit. Emily is actually joining us from Ireland. So we have got the time zones covered here. So, and Sarah and I are coming to you from Southern California. So for those of you that might not know who Warwick's is located in La Jolla, San Diego, California. And while we're not the oldest bookstore in the country, we are the oldest continuously family-owned bookstore in the United States. So 1896, my sign says there, and we're going to be celebrating our 125th anniversary this year.
Wow.
So I know, Emily, by Ireland standards, we're still a baby as far as history
By Irish
goes.
bookshop standards, you are way more than a baby. That's amazing. That's a really, really impressive
Yeah, so pretty
line of business. Wow.
And the thing, we had a historical novelist on a few weeks ago that said something like, think of all the things that Warwick's has lived through, 2 world wars, 2 pandemics, the invention of TV. I mean,
Wow.
so many things. So anyways, so just so you know, so for today, and some people might be watching this on YouTube later too, so obviously this won't make sense, but I always like to say, any way that there is to get a book, you can get it from Warwick's. So I'm going to be putting today into the Facebook chat the link that you can easily click on that, and Warwick's can send you Emily's beautiful book. But if you're in the La Jolla area and want to stop by and shop, we would love for you to do that too. So, and there's a way for you to participate today too if you're watching us on Facebook Live. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop those in the comment section too, because Emily and Sarah are going to talk for about 35-ish minutes, and then I'll pop in at the end of their conversation and bring any questions in that you all in the audience might have. So with that, I will do my job and my due diligence and do your intros and then toss it off to you ladies. Okay. So Emily Hourican is a journalist and author. She has written features for the Sunday Independent for 15 years, as well as Image Magazine, Condé Nast, Traveler, and Women and Home. She was also editor of 3 magazines. Her debut novel, The Privileged, was shortlisted for the 2016 Irish Book Awards in the Best Popular Fiction. Emily was born in Belfast, grew up in Brussels, and went to school in University College Dublin, where she earned a master's in English literature. She lives in Dublin with her husband and 3 children. They're going to talk today about what we talked about just a minute ago, the glorious Guinness Girl, so I'm looking forward to that. There it is, beautiful. And joining her today is Sarah Z. Sleeper. Sarah's first novel, Gaijin. Did I say it right this time?
Yes.
Yay! Sarah and I have been doing these for so long and I mispronounced the name of that book.
Yeah.
But I got it right this time. That came out in August 2020 to glowing reviews. She received her MFA in creative writing from Fairfield University in 2012. And prior to that, had a 20-year career as a reporter and technology writer, winning 3 journalism awards and a fellowship from the National Press Foundation. Her short story, A Few Innocuous Lines, won an award from Writer's Digest. Her nonfiction essay on Getting Vivian was published in the Shanghai Literary Review. Her poetry was exhibited at the Bellarmine.
Yes.
God, I'm having a tough time today.
I gotta make this thing shorter.
And published in A Year in Ink and Others. She was an editor at New Rivers Press and editor-in-chief of the library journal Mason's Road. Today, she's hard at work on her second novel, so we're looking forward to that. So you 2 ladies have a great conversation, and we'll see you in about a half hour or so.
Okay. Thanks, Julie. Emily.
Hi.
So nice to talk to you.
aren't you?
Is it
Really.
8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in Dublin? 9 o'clock?
It's 8 o'clock in
8
Dublin.
o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's bright and sunny outside, but you miss, well, we have all luckily missed a great big shower of hailstones. We're
Oh,
having
good.
the craziest weather, really, really
Wow.
weird for May. Yeah, should be
I
summer.
mean,
But it's
as
not.
much as I like interesting weather, we don't need the pattering sound during our conversation, I guess.
I hate interesting weather. I just like sunshine.
Move to California because
Yes,
the weather here
indeed.
is not that interesting. It's just sunny all the time. You get, so I just want to tell you that I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of the book right here. And it was just wonderful. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you.
It's really vivid. It's super insightful. I loved reading about the family that has such a unique place in Irish history, the Guinness family. And I just wanted to thank you and congratulate you on its launch this week. So this is
Thank
launch
you.
week.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's very exciting for me to be published in America. It's a wonderful feeling.
Right. So Emily is a well-published author already, but this is her first book that's being debuted in the United States. So
Mhm.
that's a big deal, right? Feels good.
Huge. It's a huge deal. It feels amazing. If anyone had told me a year ago that I would be sitting here doing this today with that beautiful book and that beautiful book cover in bookshops like Warwick's in America, I would have said, you know, go way out of that, is what I would have said. So I can't, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of hard to get my head around, but it's such a wonderful feeling. I'm so happy.
Right. And this one, I know we said this already about the cover, but do you just love the way they designed the cover?
I love it. I love the colors. I love the font. The typeface is beautiful. I love that figure as well. They
Right.
just have done such a it's such an elegant, beautiful looking book, which I think makes such a big difference. Something that you want to hold and, you know, hopefully keep and, you know, take with you.
Absolutely. If I were walking by it, I would pick it up based on the cover,
Yeah,
which is
same.
a
We all
great
judge
thing,
books by
right?
their cover. Yeah.
Were you able to have any input into the cover, or was that just they sort
Yeah.
of, yeah?
So they were so the Irish cover, I have a copy of it right here. So the Irish
Oh,
and the English cover is different. It's
yes.
equally beautiful, and the figure, the kind of very elegant figure, is the same, but obviously the colors are much darker. So the publishers then, Grand Central, said, we think the cover is a little dark for the market in America. We're going to try something else, kind of, you know, working with the theme of the figure. And I said, absolutely, go, you know, go for it. And they came back with that. And there was nothing for me to say except, wow, I love it. You know, I wouldn't have changed a thing. I'm not sure they were inviting me to want to change a thing, but even, you know, there was nothing on it that I didn't absolutely love.
That's just perfect. And we know it doesn't always happen that way, that the author doesn't always love the cover. So how fortunate that you had a company and a graphic artist who was so in line with your thinking.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so let's do this. Why don't you tell me about the plot of the book?
Yes.
Of course, not many people have had the chance to read it yet because it came out 2 days ago. And we don't want to spoil anything, but we do want to intrigue people with what they might be reading about.
Okay, so without spoilers, and as you say, the book is only out 2 days. It's a novel, and it's a novel based around the lives of 3 real people who were the Guinness girls. They were the Guinness sisters. There was Eileen, the oldest, then there was Maureen, the middle, and there was Una, who was the youngest. And they were born in Ireland at more or less the beginning of the 20th century. The oldest, Eileen, was born in 1904. They lived to the very end almost. Eileen, again, the last to die, died in 1999. So their lives spanned almost the whole of the 20th century. They were the great granddaughters of Arthur Guinness, who started the Guinness brewery. So we all know Guinness for the beer, but in Ireland, Guinness is a family name almost as much as it's a brand name. And honestly, I think that the Guinnesses are kind of like they are the closest things that we come to aristocracy in Ireland. We don't have like the English do. We don't have lords and ladies and earls and things. We just don't do that. We have the Guinnesses, and they fill that role in our lives. And so I wanted to write a novel about these 3 women because as a journalist, I've written a lot of articles about them. So, you know, the real events of their lives. And I felt that nothing really could do it justice except a novel, that you couldn't really gather all of that immensely wealthy, glamorous, exciting lives into anything other than a novel. So the way I decided to do it was I have the three girls obviously as characters, and then I created a character, a young girl called Felicity, whose nickname is Fliss. And she is sent to live with the girls when she is the same age as Maureen. She's 11 when she goes to live with them. And the reason she's sent to live with them is that she comes from a family who are kind of well-born, but they have no money. They were kind of typical of the Anglo-Irish, as we call them. Big houses, often still quite large estates, but very little actual money. She's a girl. She has no money. She has no prospects. This is like 1918. And she has no education really, except the scraps that she's been able to learn herself. So she gets sent to live with the Guinnesses to do her lessons with them. And she becomes really friendly with them. She then goes to London. So they have their coming out in London, which is this crazy society event whereby young girls were presented to the Queen in a big white dress and they had to curtsy. And from that moment, they were accepted into polite society. And they went to balls and parties, and the whole point of it was to find a husband. And it was, by the sounds of it, one of the most horrific things that could have happened to anybody. Like mesmerizing in terms of the kind of parties and, you know, the lunches and the excitement, but also like just desperately embarrassing and boring. So Fliss lives with the Guinnesses. She becomes really friendly with them, and the whole story is told through her eyes. And she also then brings in via her brother. She has a brother called Hughie, who is older than her. Being a boy, he has independence that she doesn't have. He gets mixed up in the cause for Irish freedom. So at this time, Ireland was working really hard to come out from under the occupation of Britain. We wanted to stop being part of the British colonial empire. And there was only one way to do that, and that was a series of rebellions. So there was a big rebellion in 1916 that lots of people have probably heard of because it was so significant. Yeats wrote a wonderful poem about it. It's well known. It was a failure, like all the previous revolutions, but it led to more and more concerted efforts to get Britain out of Ireland. So Fliss's brother Hughie is very mixed up in this, and he brings that aspect of the Irish Civil or the Irish War of Independence into the novel. He also brings romance. There's a growing friendship of two very young people between him and Maureen. They're only 17 at this time. They fall in love, and things happen around that, and I won't go into them because obviously that would be a spoiler. And so the action of the novel then moves from Ireland over to London, and we move into the Roaring Twenties, where there are all of this, like the jazz age parties and cocktails and treasure hunts and fancy dress parties, and everything goes. Fliss goes with them, and she sees everything, and she reports back as our narrator, you know, friendly with all the girls, involved in their lives, but always at a slight distance, so that she's a spectator and a reporter and a narrator rather than a participant.
Right. So the book is written in first person from the point of view of Fliss or Felicity. And each character has, you know, you've done an excellent, interesting job with characterizing the girls, Eileen, Maureen, and Una. And I'm wondering, this is a question that I was going to bring up later, but since we're on it now, did you feel any particular kindred spirit or relationship with one of the characters, either Felicity or one of the three Guinness girls? And if you did feel that, would you explain a little bit about why?
So I did, very much so. And I guess, I mean, you know this, right? There are characters you love who you just really connect with. And I mean, you've made them up, but they have a life that seems almost independent of yours. I love Fliss, I really do. I found her to be a very compelling character for me. She felt like people who I have slightly known. She's not based on anyone. She felt familiar.
She's not a real historical person.
No,
right, okay.
She's not. She's purely invented. But I felt very warm towards her. I felt that her struggle as somebody who is not rich and really doesn't, her life is not going to be an easy prospect because there isn't really anything for a girl at that time to do unless she gets married. And Fliss is not so likely to get married with no money. And she's living in this world that she's not really part of, where this wealth that is, the Guinnesses were so fabulously wealthy that it's quite hard to imagine that they were the only real industrial wealth in Ireland at that time. When they married, each of those girls got £1 million as a dowry, which in today's terms, that's about 64 million. And that was just a dowry. There was more money coming from the family trust for all sorts of different things. Fliss is not like that. She's like a real person.
Right.
And she's in that world and she's trying to be herself in that world. And she's also wondering how far she wants to get into it and how far she wishes to stay outside of it. So I felt very strongly for Fliss's struggles. And I also confess that I love Maureen Guinness. I really do. So the middle child, with all that middle child, look at me kind of impulse that the middle child so often has. And the stories about Maureen Guinness later in her life, so the true stories of Maureen Guinness, she became quite a monstrous person.
Oh.
So she was a caricature, of a kind of incredibly snobby, incredibly rude, hard drinking for a long period of her life, kind of thoughtless and often very cruel woman, very wealthy woman. Her own daughter, Caroline Blackwood, said that her childhood was too painful to speak of, that Maureen was not a warm and loving mother. So she became quite monstrous, but nobody is monstrous at the age of 15 or 20 even. So I'm very interested in what might the young Maureen have been like. And she may have been monstrous, but she was also super smart. And I know people who knew her, and they say that she was very magnetic, compelling person. She had a lot of personality, and that yes, she was rude and cutting and would put you down like that, but that she was also, that there was some force of character to her. So I'm very intrigued by her.
Well, you wrote her in such an interesting way because she was so smart that she would find the exact cutting thing to say.
Yes.
To whoever she was talking to, and that takes some cunning to be able to sort of quietly insult someone in a very, with decorum, if you will.
Totally.
So you did present her that way. And it was a really interesting juxtaposition to see Felicity's thinking about the way Maureen would treat people and Felicity's recognition of the cruelty of it. But also she held out hope that Maureen would learn to be a better person, it seemed like.
Yeah, absolutely. Because of course, nothing is set in stone within the life of the novel. The future hasn't happened yet. So they could still be different. Their paths could be different within the novel. So Fliss is obviously highly aware of the kind of pull in Maureen's nature. One pull is that she's a generous person and she's a kind of impulsively kind person when it suits her. And the other pull then is that she's easily bored and she can be rude and she can be very full of herself and insulting. And to watch her kind of wrestle with these different sides of herself as she gets older and wonder which of them will win out. Certainly for Fliss, who doesn't know what happens next. That must have been really interesting.
Right. And so, I want to talk more about the setting, including the 20s, and I want to talk more about the political situation. But before that, you obviously are well acquainted with research and you probably enjoy it, as many writers do. What did you like about researching this particular family? Because I'm sure there were media stories and, even gossip column notes that you could have turned to learn about all their escapades.
Yes, I'm just going to, if you see me do it, my son is singing very, very loudly in the bathroom beside us. So just ignore that. Probably the easiest thing to do. The idea of the research daunted me at first. So the previous novels that I've written are contemporary fiction. They're not based on research. And when I realized that I wanted to do this, this book, The Glorious Guinness Girls, I knew that I needed it to be as historically accurate as I could make it. You know, I wanted to know the factual broad brushstrokes of these women's lives and create a story within that. And that was obviously going to take research. And, you know, so then I reminded myself, I do have a degree in history. You know, I have a master's in English literature, exactly as Julie said, but I have a degree, my primary degree was English and history. So I was like, no, you can actually do this. And then to my delight and astonishment, my, you know, this very nerdy side of me took over, and I just loved the researching so much. And I couldn't, it was hard to stop researching and start writing. At a certain stage, I had to be ruthless and go, okay, stop amassing notebooks full of information that you will never be able to use, and just start writing your book. And I found very much that it's not like researching something that happened in the 1600s.
Okay.
It's really, really different, because this is almost living memory. Right. So as I say, you know, there are people who I met and who I know who knew the Guinness sisters. They knew them later in life. They're not contemporaries, but they knew them, they met them, they went to their houses. You know, it was easy to kind of find people to talk to about them. And then there was this thing, you know, this wonderful phrase, twilight history, which I think it's so evocative. So it's a phrase that Colin Tabine, who's a really wonderful Irish writer, he uses it, and I don't know whether he invented it or not, but what he means, he described it very beautifully. He described it basically, your grandparents' memories are almost yours because you have heard them handed down. They've only been mediated through one generation to reach you. And I know, so my grandmother was born the year before Eileen Guinness. She was born in 1903. And I know the stories of her life and her upbringing and her childhood. And obviously she wasn't being brought up by the richest family in Ireland, sadly for me. But, you know, so there's no real comparison in the way they lived. And yet they walked the same streets at the same time. They went through Dublin City in, you know, 1910, 1915, 1920. And I felt that made it accessible, psychologically accessible and kind of emotionally accessible in a way that for me, I admire people who can sit down and, you know, nail the 16th century brilliantly, because I don't think I could ever do that.
Well, so people who don't have the book yet won't know that there's a very intelligent essay at the end of the book about twilight history that you wrote. And the term twilight history is really interesting because as a writer, as you say, it might be a little more straightforward to access something that happened 100 years ago versus something that happened 600 years ago.
Definitely.
And so
I'm live on Facebook if you want to come in and say hi. You shut the door. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
That's okay. I love that he's singing. That's a brilliant thing.
Nice, right? It's a good time.
I wish my daughter was here because I would have her sing as well. We could do a binational chorus. So the difference in so people who don't write, or readers just who read a lot of history, would be, I think, interested to hear you expand a little bit more on how a writer approaches something that's from twilight history versus something that's from ancient history. So how do you go about that kind of research and fact finding and so on?
Well, the first brilliant thing is that you have access to much more material. So you don't have to, and much more primary material. So when you say primary material, you mean the actual contents of the time, letters from the time. So not books about the time. There's tons of books about, you know, the 1600s, for example, but there's not much from the 1600s itself. Whereas when you're looking for things from the 1920s, so photographs existed, film existed, you know, there's all sorts of wonderful clips. And I mean, God bless the internet. You can find so much stuff online, Pathé News, for example, you know, and then there are newspapers, which were a really rich source because there are, you know, like these wonderfully documented archives. So it's not only that you can trace the lives of the people that you're interested in, you can also fill in all of this stuff around them. Like, I would have found it really, really difficult to imagine, you know, what does it feel like to live by candlelight, for example?
Right.
Like, light is a
I
huge,
think about that too. I think about that because I'm like, how did they actually do that?
Yeah.
You know, they're walking around, they can't see anything. It's got to be weird and scary.
really weird and scary, and your days must be so much shorter, because if you're living by candlelight, you're going to go to bed much earlier. What do things look like by candlelight? You know, what does tallow smell like? Horrible, apparently. So all of that, I would have found it difficult to imagine myself in the life of somebody, you know, clothes made the way clothes were made in the 1600s, instead of which I can find clothes from the 1920s. You know, it isn't difficult. I can feel them. I know what they feel like. I have photos to look at. I have film to look at. I have letters and diaries from people who knew the Guinnesses. So not the Guinnesses themselves. They weren't great writers of letters or keepers of diaries. But their cousin Brian was a great writer of letters and keeper of diaries. And then other people who knew them as part of London society. So they pop in and out of other people's recollections and diaries really quite often. So in the end, lack of material, you know, there's no lack of material. It's there. And there is, as I say, then this feeling that I can access it because I knew my grandmother, because my grandmother lived at the same time. I don't find that emotionally it was hard to connect with what it must have been like to be, you know, a young girl, a 16-year-old girl growing up on the outskirts of Dublin in 1918, 1919.
Right. That's really fascinating. And we talk, you know, the book is set in the Roaring 20s, basically. And so that's a period that people have a lot of, you know, fantastical ideas about. They know something about it. They may not know a lot about it, depending on their age, I would think. But I found really interesting the fact that you included what I would call some very edgy scenarios in the 20s, which people probably may or may not realize were going on, such as transgender or gay, you know, or bisexual people, which were maybe not talked about that much at that time. And, you know, drug use. I think we all know that that was going on, but you incorporated it so seamlessly into the fabric of the background of the book. Was that something that you had to think about doing, or you just did it automatically because it's part of what was going on in that very interesting era?
I guess it was such a big part of what I already knew about the era. I find the 1920s fascinating because, and there's loads of talk at the moment, that as we entered the 2020s, on the back of a pandemic, just as the 1920s happened after the Spanish flu, like this worldwide pandemic, way more lethal even than what we have been through. And then there was this kind of mad explosion into the 1920s. And a lot of the time people see the glamour. They see the amazing clothes, beautiful clothes, the super short hair, like the style was amazing, the bobbed hairstyles, the headbands, the dresses, all the new dances like the Charleston, people drinking cocktails and all these wonderful parties. And I see all of that, but then I also see, because I've always been so interested in the era that I've read quite a lot about it for a long time, I also see the energy that came from was a really kind of, you know, it was a sad and terrible energy that was left over from this appalling war, the Great War of 1914, 1918, followed by the Spanish flu epidemic, in which so many people died. So young men died on the fields of Flanders, and then loads of young people died due to the Spanish flu, which primarily killed young people rather than old people. And so the 1920s was this massive release of energy, and it looked and sounded amazing. But what drove it, I think, was this miserable, this heartbreak, this guilt, this kind of trauma, really, that was coming on the back of the war and the Spanish flu pandemic. And because of that, I feel, and also because it was a lot of young people, there
Right.
was a very seedy side to the 1920s. So
Mhm.
drugs were a big thing. And a lot of, I mean, there were these very kind of privileged and well-born young people who became very sad drug addicts,
Right.
alcoholics. I mean, alcoholism was a massive thing. So it looked amazing. And then, as you say, it was kind of suddenly possible for men to be, and women, to be gay in a way that they had never previously been
Right.
allowed to manifest that. And that's a great thing. And, as I say, it looks all wonderful and amazing and super fabulous and glamorous. But then the underneath of it is that there were this kind of coterie of people who didn't really come out of the 1920s.
Right.
They died, or, or they've lived
Right.
like kind of drug addicted, limited lives. And, a lot of them, when all the parties were done and everyone had swept up the confetti and the feather, and the great crash of 1929 came and destroyed the economy all over the world, you were left with this kind of, this sad vision of what the
Right.
1920s had been.
And you conveyed that, you foreshadowed that by showing us the behavior of characters, minor, let's say minor characters, but characters in the book that were living on the edge. And, I won't give anything away, but just to say that they're portrayed within the fabric of the whole story. So you get a real sense too that someone like Felicity and the Guinness sisters, they're a little over their heads in the midst of all of that. So that was really interesting. And I do want to get to a little bit back to the plot. And I know people know something about Irish history, but I also know they might not know as much as the book talks about. But you talk about sort of it. I would like for you, if you could, to thread the looming political situation into the family situation. So there's a political situation that's happening sort of outside the gates of their estates, and they're by and large sheltered, right? But
Yeah.
particularly Felicity, but also others also have, some gaining understanding of what's happening. How does that political situation impact the plot line of what happens with the Guinness girls?
So I brought those two things together in the book. And this is one of the liberties that, as an author and as somebody writing a novel, I felt I was entitled to do. There isn't, I mean, the Guinness girls were not political. They were not politically motivated in Ireland at that time. They were very young. They were 15, 16, 17. They lived, I always kind of think of it as they kind of lived on top of Ireland rather than in Ireland. So they had this great big home called Glenmaroon, which is still, it's still there, on the northern outskirts of Dublin City. And there's this wonderful story that I just loved of, in 1922, there was a civil war going on in Ireland. The War of Independence had led to a treaty with Britain, and immediately, as so often happens, there were two sides, those who wanted to accept the treaty and those Irish who did not want to accept the treaty, and there was a civil war between them. As part of that, the Four Courts, which is our biggest legal building, was burnt. And there is this wonderful account of the three girls standing in their home in Glenmaroon, looking over the treetops of the city and watching the smoke rising into the sky. And that, as far as I know, is a true story. So that actually happened. There isn't any way that, as incredibly wealthy, incredibly privileged, very young girls, they would have been involved in what was happening. They would have been only peripherally really aware of it, and only then in as much as it threatened to damage the family's interests. So, while it was Irish people fighting on the streets, that probably didn't mean a whole lot to them. When it looked as if the Guinness factory might suffer, that would have meant more to them. And then when the burning of big houses, so a lot of big estates were burnt out, as a kind of a symbolic gesture of getting rid of the British oppressors. And that will have certainly made an impression on them, because they would have wondered, were they vulnerable? and their cousin Henry Guinness, who lived really close to where I am living, he was burnt out. His house was set on fire by masked IRA men who came in, sprinkled petrol, and threw a match. And they knew all about that. So they would have been watching, slightly aware, but not terribly aware. But I wanted to bring them into it a little bit more. And that was where I kind of worked at this character, Huey, who is the brother of Felicity. So Huey, as I said, being male, being older, had much more freedom. Huey was an Irish revolutionary. So he was, first of all, interested and involved in the War of Independence. And then he was on the anti-treaty side in the Civil War. So he has an involvement, and they have this kind of way in through him. So they're hearing things back, and they don't much care, except in as much as it impacts on them. There's a party, and there's a question about whether Huey can come to the party, because Huey's busy going to meetings and, you know, involving himself in a revolution. And they care about that very much, much more than they care about the reasons why Ireland wants to get rid of Britain or any of those things. So I tried to do it. I really needed it to be there because I just think it's too, for me, it's too compelling a part of the landscape of their lives not to do it.
Well,
but
so
I needed
the character of Huey provides a very interesting link to the outside world, and also a romantic entanglement, the potential for a romantic entanglement. Plus, he's emotionally grounding character for the narrator. As her brother, who she really relies on. So that he was a very well drawn, interesting person. So I want to ask you a few more things before we run out of time. And this is the hard one to kind of put into words, but I say thematically, the novel seems to be about sort of the inability to escape what you were born into versus the desire or the necessity to do so. Let's say people on the outside who really, felt like they had no choice but to fight and for change. And then the girls on the inside of their, estate who really, chose, if that's the right word, to stay in the lap of luxury. And again, without really giving away the plot, I'm curious about what you're trying to say, or if there's something you're trying to say about sort of what we're born into versus opportunities we might have to do otherwise versus complacency, or even just a decision to stay where we are. So do you have sort of a theme in mind there, or?
I do. So one of the many things that interested me about the Guinness girls was how modern they looked and how old-fashioned they were in their attitude. So they looked like they were, right up there with the bright young people of the 1920s, breaking all the old ways, doing things differently, this surge of modern energy. But then when you look at what they did with their lives, that doesn't follow through. So there was, the early 1920s was this great period of, women's liberation. Like there was so much work being done around votes for women and property rights for women. And some of their friends were involved in that. That was something that was just as appealing to a lot of aristocratic women as it was to more middle-class women. But they didn't get involved in that at all. They didn't in any way immerse themselves in change or, kind of different ways of doing things, politics, any of that. They came out, they got married. So between the three of them, they had 8 husbands. So 2 of them got married 3 times.
What is that, 2.2 each?
2.2 each, yeah, the 0.2. Exactly. And, they were hostesses, they were kind of patrons of the arts to an extent, but they didn't do anything. So what looked to me like such a time of opportunity, because the world was changing very rapidly around them, and they chose not to pursue opportunities outside what they had been born into. And I think that's really interesting. In the novel, I make Fliss have a slightly different path to them, because I wanted to show what was possible for women at that time. Like careers were suddenly possible in a way that they never really had been before. And I thought it was really, I wanted to bring that into it. And I wanted to highlight the fact that they didn't do that. They could have done it and they didn't. So there's this really interesting thing about, as you say, opportunity versus, you know, what you're given and what you make of what you're given. And I still find it very interesting. I also think it speaks in a really kind of, you know, a terrible way about women's lives at that time,
Yeah,
even the lives of really, really rich and privileged women. I
right.
still think that, you know, if you're not brought up to, you know, to be really well educated, to believe, to want something, to be able to do something, you know, it's like not everybody, it's difficult to look outside what you have been given and what you've been born into. Like it is hard to do that, and they didn't do it. And I just think that it says such a lot about, you know, all the money in the world, and yet, you know, what chances and what opportunities did they have? Not so many, really, or not ones that they knew to take.
Right. Well, I mean, gosh, I think that theme sticks no matter what the era is, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
whether you
yeah,
choose
always.
to blaze a new path or you choose to sort of stick with it's like the person who stays close to home or the person who goes out and does other things. So it's a
Yeah.
very universal theme. And I'm wondering, along with that theme, do you think there is sort of an emotional center or truth that a reader would take away by watching the paths of these gals?
I think that there is a strong emotional truth around the idea of being true to yourself. And
Okay.
that's a really glib thing. Like we all say this, right? You got to be true to yourself. You got to be true to yourself. And I think that we do have to be true to ourselves. But what I think is very interesting is figuring out the self you are that you want to be true to. You see what I mean? You
Yeah.
know, I mean, it is quite difficult for young people to work out who they are and what they want to be true to and why they should be true to themselves. You know, why not be true to yourself? So that for me is really interesting. And watching them all trying to do that, like all four of the girls in the novel, so the three Guinness girls and Fliss, the companion, watching each of them try to do that, and each of them struggle with it in different ways.
Hmm.
You know, which is the circumstance of their personality and, you know, the kind of the
Right.
things that are around them and, you know, the kind of raw material that they are. They do all struggle. I mean, the Guinness girls struggle as much as Fliss does. They have, you know, they have all this money, they have all this kind of, you know, freedom, or they should have, but they still have to try and work out who are they. And Fliss has to work out who she is, and massively she has to work out, does she want to be them or
Right.
does she want to be something else? And what is the true path for her to take?
And so that's a good actual cliffhanger because we don't know until we read the book. We kind of know because the Guinness girls have been written about, so that's easy to sort of see how they live their lives, but we don't know the narrator. What does she choose? She can choose to reside in the lap of luxury and
Yeah,
have a
it's an option.
debut with the queen,
Yeah.
and or she can choose something else. And so that's an interesting question to leave in people's minds. You know, if you were given the chance to choose the lap of luxury or to choose something that had more action in the world, what would you
Mhm.
choose?
Yeah.
Would you go for the money or would you go for something more meaningful?
Isn't it a massive question?
It's just a big
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Yes, really. Wow. So this is such fun to talk about this. I want to show everybody again the beautiful cover here. And I always have to ask this, and it's, if you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but everyone always wants to know what you're working on now, in as much as you are willing to share it.
Yeah, absolutely willing to share. I'm working on the second in the series.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm working on it currently. It's called the Glorious Guinness Girls, A Hint of Scandal. And it
Ooh.
takes them. So this first book, The Glorious Guinness Girls, ends with their marriages. So they all got married at the end of the 1920s, the first marriages.
Right.
So then the next book moves into the 1930s. We watch how those marriages begin to unfold, children arrive, how the dynamic with their husbands between themselves against the backdrop of the 1930s, which was this massively polarized time. There was the rise of fascism on one hand, and there was the rise of communism on the other. There was a lot of very kind of fraught marches in London. There was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of poverty and hunger. And it's an extremely frenzied kind of, kind of political background. And they're there still with all their money, now with their husbands. So the greater freedom that being a married woman brings, and with children. And it's how they negotiate those things with then this kind of rising political situation in the background.
How excellent. Everyone loves a historical novel that has a sequel. I mean, we all look forward to that when we read one. We always want to read the next one. So I think that's—
Well, I hope so.
I can speak as a reader and a writer, and it's completely true. And just as a final thought before I stop asking questions, you write with such exquisite detail and such vivid description. You set the scene so beautifully. Is that something that you do naturally as a journalist too, or is that something you kind of reserve for your novel writing?
That's a really good question. You've less scope to do it in journalism and a lot less time. I feel though that if you can't imagine where you are and what a person looks like and what they're doing and what the place feels like, it's just like you don't want to be a giant head floating in space.
Floating with no grounding. Yeah.
Exactly. You need landscape and background and a sense of place and stuff. So I love it when I read. I love to feel that really immersive feeling of knowing where you are and knowing how a room is laid out and how a house is laid out. And so I try and do it in my writing as well. But yeah, I do less of it in my journalism.
And you do so beautifully. So people have that to look forward to when they read the novel.
Thank you.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, I'm back.
Hi.
We have some, these are, it's so funny because I think when I talked earlier about how we have all the time zones covered, we have Judy Williams Matson coming from Kansas City, or from Kansas, I should say. So we've got the middle of America covered. So that was really fun. And then Kershia McNamara says, hi, Emily. So I don't know.
Hi,
Kershia. So hopefully she's still on watching, or she'll see it on repeat. So that's kind of fun. And I loved at the beginning, and I didn't realize this, when you were talking about how Ireland doesn't have the lords and earls and aristocracy. I had no idea. I thought they had the same that England had. So that was something.
No, we don't. We've got we've no king, we've no queen.
Well, the Guinnesses seem like the Kennedys, maybe something like that.
Yeah, they do, don't they? Yes, definitely. I mean, there's so many of them. It's a massive, massive family. Brewing Guinnesses, banking Guinnesses, clerical Guinnesses. There is all sorts of different arms and cousins going on forever and ever.
Wow, so interesting. So, question to the title. You guys didn't get to that, did you? Guys, I was in the background doing some other things.
About the title.
Was that always your title? Was that your working title, or was that an evolution coming to that title?
I think that was always the title. That's a good question. I don't actually remember. I think it was always the title, because that's what they were called in like the newspapers. The paparazzi were pretty obsessed with the doings of the Guinness sisters, and they called them the Glorious Guinness Girls or the Golden Guinness Girls. So we kind of kicked around, would we do Glorious or Golden? And in the end, we decided the Glorious Guinness Girls.
It's all about the alliteration, really.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure. Absolutely. Well, I know it's getting late in Ireland, so we're going to let you go. But before we do that, Sarah, real quick, if people want to follow you or learn more about you, where's the best place to send them?
Sure. Thank you. SarahZSleeper.com.
Perfect. You can find all your social media and everything there. Fantastic. And Emily, for you as well, is there a central location that we can send people to?
Yeah, I think same as Sarah, the website, emilyhourican.com. And that link to all the social.
Perfect. And it was such a great conversation. Thank you so much. And
Thank
thank you
you.
to Grand Central for allowing us to host this today. We love our publishing partners. We love, even though you're a published author in Ireland, we love highlighting new authors here in the United States. So it's really fun to welcome you to.
We got to break the news in the
Yeah,
US.
exactly. So
Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Emily.
much for having me.
all right, and I will
Thanks
take us
for
off of
chatting.
Facebook. And thank you
Brilliant.
everybody for watching. Even if you're on YouTube, thanks for watching too.
Thanks, you guys. See you later.
Bye.